This is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you for joining us for this special episode. I don't have any sort of notes. I'm just going to be going off the cuff. This is basically an hour-long special comment episode, and I really hope you enjoy it. Over the last few months, I've been kind of ill. I have had really bad chronic sinus infections for the last 2 or 3 months. It started back in July, and we're now into, mid to late September, and it's pretty bad. I'm getting over it. I have a voice, and I'm still, blowing my nose and coughing and things like that, and still trying to get over it, and it's been really bad. But sinus stuff is stuff I've lived with my whole life, and every few years I have something really bad that kind of crops up like this. And I'm just glad that I was able to get into a doctor and get it taken care of. Because I am improving. Hopefully my voice sounds pretty good to you guys. That's the most important thing, that I have my voice. And with that in mind, I tweeted earlier today a little thread about this, and I'll kind of echo the comments I made there, that one of the things that's been interesting about this last few months is that because my voice has been sort of in and out because of my sinus infection and sort of chronic sinusitis, it's given me the opportunity to listen more. I find myself listening more to people, to different ideas. I don't get so quick to mouth off about a particular subject. Sometimes because I'm just too tired and my voice isn't good enough to, and whatever. And it sometimes sucks because I love talking and I love being a podcaster, and that's what I do. And I like to think that, hopefully you like hearing what I have to say. And I've really just reconsidered a lot of things. And with that in mind, the thing I've thought a lot about lately is the fact that I feel like my ideas about politics have shifted a lot. And I guess the way to frame it is that my own individual sort of ideas, the things that I care about, the things that matter to me, haven't changed. It's the environment around me that has, and I've sort of had to readjust based on that. I always considered myself a person of the left, and in some respects I still do. I believe in a society that's based on liberty and equality and equal opportunity and tolerance and openness and understanding. And for the longest time, I really did think that that was what the left wanted. And I think the vast majority of it still does. I would say that what I'm about to talk about is not new to a lot of my listeners, but I feel like it's time for me to really express how I've changed and how I think my changing might reflect upon the show. I'm joining a whole group of people now who are, public intellectuals, artists, philosophers, talk show hosts, what have you, who've really tapped into this idea called the New Center. And so I would say that I am, in effect, joining the New Center. I've thought about this for a while, and I'm very committed to the idea that I'm very excited about the prospect of what this means and where I'm going to be going forward. So to give you a sense of how I've evolved over the last probably couple of years, especially over the last few months, is that, I grew up with parents who are Democrats. My dad is a committed Democrat. My wife is a Democrat. Her mother is a union Democrat. So I come from a family on the left. And with a lot of it, I still very much hold those ideals. I believe in I still believe to a certain extent in a stronger central government. I believe in, a reasonable defense. I do believe in social safety nets. I believe in the possibility someday of some form of universal health care, whether it be in the form of sort of a market-based system or a government-based system. I look forward to seeing a day where we can have more of a universal coverage. I'm pro-choice. I'm pro-gay marriage and pro-marriage equality rather. And I've I support, for the most part, I do support the efforts of Black Lives Matter, and I very much care about the issues going forward about individual rights and the invasion of privacy and the invasion of people's rights by law enforcement. Um, so having said all of that, the thing that has really made me shift and the thing that has really disturbed me is what's been happening over the last few years in regards to, and this is nothing new to people who listen to people like Sam Harris or Dave Rubin or Steven Pinker or Michael Shermer. Um, that the left has a problem with free speech, and that they are not comfortable with free expression of ideas, which is sad to me because I always thought of that as being an issue of the left. I always thought that sort of being a free speech absolutist and caring about the open marketplace of ideas and open expression, that was something the left had. That was our thing. I used to always make the joke that the right's thing is the Second Amendment and ours is the first. And I think to a certain extent some of that's true, but I do think that there's a real problematic trend going on within the left, and it's on the right too. I know there was recently an article about how there's a vast majority of American college students, somewhere of like 61% or something like that. I think this was in the New York Times, about how 61% think that hate speech is not protected by the Constitution, which is in fact it is. Threat of violence is not protected in the Constitution, nor is libel or slander. Those aren't either. Or fraud. But hate speech is. Holding an unpopular opinion, no matter how extreme it is, as long as you're not lying about a person or trying to commit some kind of fraud or you're threatening to kill someone or harm someone, that's protected under the First Amendment. And there's a vast swath of American college students, people who are just a few years younger than me, I'm 27, who see that it's okay to shout down speakers, that it's okay to deplatform people, that it's okay to come back to an argument with an insult rather than a counter argument. This is a problem because I think that it's going to cause a sort of moral rot within the left that is not going to be able to be easily fixed. And I don't think this is the vast majority of the left. I really don't. I think this is a very vocal minority, very much like sort of the Christian conservatives on the right, who do some of the sort of the same thing. And the one thing I've always hated, and it's something I've hated that comes from both sides of the political spectrum, is moralizing. I don't like when politicians do it. I really don't like when public people do it. I don't like it. I believe that you should live however the fuck you want to, so long as you don't violate the rights of others. It's that simple. And in that regard, I'm a civil libertarian. I think people should live the lives they want to, as long as they're not harming other people's rights to live the lives as they want to. That, to me, that's the whole crux of freedom. It's the whole crux of individual rights. And when it came to, free speech, I always had a problem when you have people like on the Democratic Party side. I remember when Hillary Clinton was in the Senate, and this was kind of her thing, was more heavy regulation of video games, which I thought was ridiculous. It's just like the same kind of book banning that happened in the early 20th century. When books like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, or James Joyce's Ulysses, or Henry Miller's, Tropic of Cancer or whatever, or William Burroughs, Naked Lunch, when these books were sort of so risque and so problematic that they should not be allowed to be distributed publicly. And, the Democratic Party is not immune from this. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that one of the biggest crackdowns on free speech that ever happened in this country's history happened under a Democratic president with Woodrow Wilson, when you had the Alien and Sedition Acts during World War I, and people were in prison for simply expressing their opinion. Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate for president from my neck of the woods in Terre Haute, Indiana. He distributed pamphlets that were very critical of the war and called for pacifism. He was arrested for doing so. For merely expressing an opinion, he was in prison for almost 2 years and had a 10-year prison sentence for what he did, and was only left out by a commutation of his sentence by President Warren Harding in 1921. So, on this particular issue, it appears that Warren Harding, who in American history goes down as one of the worst presidents of American history, actually had more moral clarity on the issue of free speech than Woodrow Wilson did. Woodrow Wilson did not care about civil liberties, and yet he's sort of a liberal darling. He's very fondly remembered today. And there was a lot of good that he did in terms of the advancing of liberal democracy around the world. But having said that, if the man wasn't a racist, which I do to a certain extent think he was a product of his time, as most people back then were. But he had cabinet members who were pretty openly racist. And he showed Birth of a Nation in the White House. So I bring this up not to do the sort of canard that people like, Dinesh D'Souza or others who say the Democratic Party is still like that today. And I don't think so. There was a party shift that happened with, the New Deal and the eventual sort of Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. There was a real party shift that happened where African Americans who had roundly gone with the Republican Party since the days of Lincoln went to the Democratic Party, and the sort of Dixiecrats who felt very uncomfortable with civil rights and sort of the expansion of the modern Democratic Party, the modern left, sort of took safe refuge in the Republican Party, which is how the party switch happened. So I don't love talking about this in terms of Democrat or Republican. I tend to prefer to talk about this in terms of left and right, because you could have had left Republicans, people like Nelson Rockefeller or even, or centrist Republicans, people like Dwight Eisenhower. And you could also have right Democrats, people like Robert Byrd and George Wallace and whatnot. So it's not to say that the parties haven't shifted. That's a little bit of an aside. But the main point that I want to drive home is the fact that there's a shift that's going on in the country that has made me very worried about the future of the Democratic Party and the modern left. I voted for Obama twice. I worked on Obama's 2008 campaign. I think he was a good president, and I still think that the Democratic Party should be proud of his time in the White House, despite the flaws of the candidate and the flaws of his presidency, which are many. They should be pretty proud of it. And one of the things that Obama did that worked, and he could get away with it, being an African-American man, he didn't have to sort of play into the identity politics in a way that sort of Hillary Clinton had to, because it was sort of implicit, right? Because he was a product of sort of the meritocratic American dream, the fact that his mom was from Kansas, his father was from Kenya, and raised by a single mom, raised by his grandparents, his grandparents. His grandmother worked on the bomber assembly lines in World War II. His grandfather was a soldier in the war. He was raised by people who are incredibly intelligent and bright and kind and good Americans. And his story is America's story in a lot of ways. And, his candidacy and his presidency has made me very proud to be an American, and very proud to have supported him and to be a part of the movement that helped elect him. I do feel very proud about that. And so what made me unhappy, or what made me sad, was the fact that Hillary Clinton could not really tap into the same thing that Obama could. And what I mean by that is that Obama was able to articulate a politics of inclusion and diversity without having to sort of play the left's identity politics game in the way that others would have to in a few years. He was able to do that because he was an African American, because he was an identity in and of itself. So in some other respects, this sort of commitment to diversity and pluralism was sort of implied. He didn't have to really work hard at it. Whereas Hillary Clinton did, because Hillary Clinton was a woman who was white, who was a product of the political system, had been around forever, and had run for president once, had been Secretary of State. This is someone who had not gone away and came with so much political baggage, good or bad. Some of it was founded, some of it was complete bullshit, but some of it was genuinely legitimate, and that she just seemed so uncomfortable, and and she strikes me as a person who's not comfortable in her own skin, and that's too bad, because I think that she's an incredibly. I don't think she would have been a bad president. I said to people, I said, the only difference between her presidency and Obama's would have been exactly the same, except for there probably would have been a more aggressive foreign policy. And that's it. I mean, I really do think it would have been about the same, and I could have lived with that. I mean, it's not perfect, but I could have lived with that. This is where I differ from others, because I did vote for Clinton, and I am a registered Democrat. I'm sort of going on a tangent again. The main point that I wanted to drive home about the Democrats that I think is a problem, and I think this was articulated very well in Mark Lilla's new book, The Once and Future Liberal, is that if the Democratic Party and the modern left in general double down on identity politics, they will lose. And I agree with that. I think that the obsession with identity, rather than a commitment to ideas, is really what's going to harm our political discourse. And we see this on both sides of the political spectrum. And what's really interesting is that identity politics was not really born by the left. It was born by the political right. The first sort of identity politics movement that happened in this country was the Christian evangelical movement in the mid-20th century. It's really the first time where all these disparate groups united as an identity and said, we are quote unquote Christians, which they had never really done before. They were, what were you? Most people wouldn't say they were Christians. They would say, well, I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm a Lutheran, or I'm a Protestant, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Baptist, or whatever, Methodist, if I didn't say that before. But there was a shift that happened because of the huge wave of social change that happened in the mid-20th century in regards to civil rights movement, then the women's rights movement, and the Roe v. Wade, the crumbling of prayer in school, the removal of laws banning the teaching of evolution, which happened with the Supreme Court decision in the mid-60s. All of these things had a really adverse effect on the religious, sort of more conservative religious movement in this country, and they united together as sort of a united front to go after this. And with that came Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, and Pat Robertson and whatnot, and it would eventually lead to the ascendancy of the modern conservative right and Ronald Reagan. So they really did it. I mean, and you could even go back further than that, talk about the Prohibition Movement, which was also, in my opinion, another identity politics, because it all peddled and we are good Christian folk, and we think this is bad, and we're going to regulate vice as a way to sort of impose Christian values on America, and to sort of fix it from within. We're going to create the heaven on earth. This again goes back to the problem with moralizing in politics. There's nothing wrong with having moral stances. There's a difference between, just as a quick aside, there's a difference between having moral stances and making moral commitments as a political person and being a moralizer. Those are two different things, and the moralizing in politics is a huge problem. And so, but anyway, the modern left really embraced the politics of identity, according to Lilla, in the sort of mid to late 20th century. That the civil rights movement and the genius of the civil rights movement, the genius of the women's rights movement of the 20th century, and the gay rights movement was that it was a movement dedicated to the idea that we do not seek to be treated better or worse than anybody else. What we seek is a society in which our rights are equal to that of everyone else. And so it wasn't it was extension of political rights. It wasn't a granting of new political rights. It was an extension of rights that should have been granted to citizens, these citizens, but decades, century, if not centuries before, that weren't granted because of sort of the moral backwardness of the times in which our country was founded, and sort of the emergence of a more moral country. And these movements succeeded for that precise reason, because they were coalitional movements. They were movements interested in bringing broad coalitions of people together. This is why the civil rights movement succeeded, because you had vast swaths of diversity of people. You had secular African Americans, you had religious African Americans, you had secular Jews, you had religious Jews, you had Catholics as a part of the Catholic priests, and as well as atheists and secular people like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and others. It was a broad coalition. The women's rights movement was the same way, which is why the ERA was so almost successful. But the problem was that there was a shift that happened, and the shift went away from sort of arguing for certain ideas, equality, things like that, to this obsession with identity, that what defines me is not what I believe in, but what I am intrinsically. And to me, there's always been a problem with something like that, in the sense that there's nothing wrong with being proud of your identity. For example, I'm a German American. My ancestors were mostly German, and some were English, but most of them were German. And I'm a proud descendant of German immigrants, most of which who came in the mid-19th century. I'm very proud of that, but that doesn't inform my politics. Only in as much as it informs my view of immigration policy, and the fact that I think we should have a more open and tolerant immigration policy, but one still rooted in law enforcement, making sure we're keeping bad people out of the country that would do us harm. And the shift was that we went from a politics of ideas to a politics of identities, and this happened on both sides of the on the political spectrum. On the political right, you had the rise of evangelical Christians ascending into the political apparatus and asserting themselves, right? So that identity was very powerful. And then on the left, you had the ascendancy of sort of identity politics of sort of the coalition of different minorities. So African Americans, the LGBT community, and, women, Native Americans, whatever. And again, none of that's necessarily a problem. I think embracing one's culture and heritage and background, I think is beautiful. I think it's wonderful. And I think if we were to have more open conversations with each other about our differences, I think we would learn something from one another. Problem is, we're not really having that, because there's a pocket of these people on both sides who hold the other side in contempt. They don't just disagree with them; they hold them in outright contempt. And because they hold them in outright contempt, they're not willing to actually discuss with them. This is why you got the issue with I think the most recent example is what happened to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State. Brett Weinstein had written an email explaining to the university why he did not support a new policy that was going to be instituted on the university campus. And to give you some background, the way it was going to go was every year they did something called a Day of Absence, and it was based on a play. And the play was basically where, imagine in a town if all of the African Americans just went on strike, or not went on strike, but just didn't show up to work one day and weren't there to take care of things. And imagine how lesser our society would be because of that. And it was this kind of beautiful metaphor about the horrors of Jim Crow and discrimination and segregation and how it harms us as a people. And I think that's wonderful. That wasn't Weinstein's objection. Every year, the university would have a day of absence where the students of color on campus would leave. And, they would protest and they would outwardly leave the campus. And I don't think that's a problem at all. What he had a problem with was the year that he wrote his critique of what was going on was they wanted to shift the policy away from being African Americans choosing to not be on the campus or people of color not choosing to be on campus, but that the students who were minorities actively asked the white students to not come to campus. That the day of absence was not an absence of people voluntarily leaving, but there was one side actively saying to another side, we don't want you to show up this day. And that's a huge shift in what the culture was. And so Weinstein wrote an email saying, like, this is discrimination. This is a problem. And as someone who was a Jewish American, and he is Jewish, Weinstein made a point of, like, imagine the flip of that, where the white, faculty or the white students had asked the black people not to come to campus, or had asked the Jewish students, don't come to campus today. And instead of the Jewish students as an act of solidarity and protest, leaving on their own accord in voluntary action, that they were asked by another part of the student body or the faculty body to not come to campus. And he thought that was a huge problem, as do I. And he wrote this extremely, I think, moral and reasonable email, and he got fucking raked through the coals because of it. He got protested. He got yelled at. The fucking president of the university was held hostage by the fucking students and shit. He couldn't go to the bathroom by himself. So there's all kinds of crazes. You can read all about it. New York Times did a piece about it. I know that, you listen to, Weinstein's interview on Joe Rogan or Dave Rubin, and you can get a sense of the nuance of this, because I might be messing up some of the details here. But the bigger point is that the thing about Brett Weinstein is that he was a liberal. He was a progressive. He was somebody who openly gave up a more prestigious academic position in order to protest for African American women's labor rights. This is a guy who had been on the side of, for lack of a better way of saying it, was on the side of the angels for his entire career. But because he voiced an opinion that wasn't really even that inflammatory, but merely expressing an opinion, he got completely mercilessly destroyed for it. He got called a racist. He got called a bigot. He got called this and that, whatever. The students started carrying weapons on campus, which was pretty disturbing. And so these are the kinds of things where, they may be on the left, but this is totally illiberal behavior. This is not conducive to a free and open and tolerant society. This is not what we should be advocating for. And again, these kids are the extremes. The problem is that the university administrators don't have the fucking courage to stand up to these kids. And that's what they are. They're fucking children, And that's what happens when you have a university system that's set up, especially within public colleges. And this happens in private colleges too, but especially in public colleges, where the students are taking out substantial student loans in order to be there. So instead of being students, in many ways, they're customers. And so what the administrators are working on is not so much student relations, so much as it is customer service. So they're going to kowtow to this, as they do. And, let's just say for a second that you didn't like Weinstein's opinion. Fine, you didn't agree with it, whatever. You have all the right to protest his opinion. You have all the right in the world to write a rebuttal to him, whatever. What I think was really disturbing was the idea that the university did not defend him. And in not defending him, they let their campus descend into chaos. And he lost his tenured position. His wife also had to resign. He resigned. And in order for it not to be a huge lawsuit, because he did pursue legal action, they just paid out a huge settlement of $500,000 to him and his wife. So the university lost $500,000 because they wouldn't defend a professor's right to express an opinion in an email. This is where we're at. This is a problem. And this is not acceptable in a free society. The latest thing that happened this week with a professor who wrote an article in defense of colonialism. Now, you can certainly argue that his methodology was flawed. You could certainly argue with some of the scholarly approach to whatever he said. But he sadly had to retract his article from the academic journal it was published in merely because people did not like what he said. And the goal of academic discourse is that someone writes something and maybe you see flaws in that. And this is very true in the physical sciences as well as in the humanities, which he was writing in. I'm a student of the humanities. I mean, I wrote a graduate thesis, and there's a peer review process. And, usually scholarly articles go through a peer review process where anonymous readers will read them, review them, critique them, make sure your arguments are tight. And then what often happens is with an article is that you'll publish the article and then a slew of people might respond to you. And then those articles are published and you get this really nice, interesting discourse going on within the academic literature. That's not going to happen with this article because once it came out, people called him a racist, a bigot, whatever, as if that's an argument. And then he had to retract it and under pressure. And again, this is what the modern authoritarian left does. They use fear and intimidation to get what they want. Because they can't actually take the time to actually argue or critique the ideas on their own merits. They have to just yell at someone and call them a racist and a bigot. And that's a huge problem. To me, this is why we live in a situation where authoritarianism is so popular, because illiberalism is gaining ground and liberalism is losing ground. Whether it's sort of the, Antifa on the left and the extremists on the left who want to punch people and things like that. And then on the right, you've got these, the horrible shit that happened in Charlottesville, the horrible things that happened, the death of Heather Heyer, the horrible people, carrying tiki torches and things like that. And screaming, blood and soil, and you will not replace us, and things like this. This is all indicative of a larger problem in our society, which is that we've moved away from being a society of ideas to being a society of identities. And that identity is the only thing that matters. It's the only currency that has any weight to it anymore. And that ideas themselves are jettisoned in defense of an identity. And this works both ways. On the left, it works with the extremists who think that, that only white people can be racist or things like that. Or on the extreme right with the alt-right and the white supremacy and the authoritarianism there. So this is a problem. I want to stress here that I'm picking more on the left because I come from the left and I'm disappointed that my side is doing this kind of shit because they should fucking know better. But the difference is that authoritarianism rather than libertarianism, not libertarianism as a political philosophy, but just sort of small L libertarianism or liberalism, small L liberalism is losing out to authoritarianism. And it breaks my heart because I'm seeing a society that's sort of ripping at the seams. And, we've been now through two presidencies that their intent was to bring people together. George W. Bush with his compassionate conservatism and Obama with the politics of hope and change. And yes, we can. Both presidents, regardless of how you feel about them politically, both of them were very interested in that kind of idea, and yet they ended up being two very polarizing presidents. And now we live under the ascendancy of Donald Trump. And Trump, to me, is the logical conclusion to all of this. That when you become when political discourse is divorced from ideas, when it is divorced from complex conversations about the costs and benefits of the trade-offs of specific policies, and having a rich intellectual dialogue between liberals and conservatives, which has been the bedrock of our political life, we're now falling into a camp of sort of liberals versus authoritarians. And this is global. I mean, if you look at the world today, you have Trump here in the United States, you have the emergence of Marine Le Pen in France. I mean, she doubled the vote percentage that her father had gained for the National Front in France since 2002. She didn't win. She lost by a large margin, but she won, I think, a third of the vote in the French presidential election. And now you have, Emmanuel Macron. Macron is not gaining ground. This was a guy who ran on the new sort of politics of centrism, and it's not gaining hold, which is heartbreaking for me as somebody who's sort of moving to the center. Seeing a centrist candidate like Macron not being successful is heartbreaking. But this is indicative of another problem, which is that we have in this country, in the United States, and maybe this is the case in Europe and other countries, but I'm going to speak specifically the United States because that's my bread and butter, is that we have this cycle of, it's kind of like this, and I'm going to kind of think of it as a circle that kind of goes clockwise. So at the start of it, it's like, everything is fucked up and everything sucks. It's obvious everything sucks, obviously, because of the people in power. Therefore, we need to throw all the fuckers out and replace them with other people. Well, then those people are elected. And nothing gets better because they don't have the experience or the institutional knowledge to do it. And shit gets worse. And then people go, man, all these people fucking suck. So we're going to throw them all out again. And so this is a vicious cycle. And the logical conclusion of that vicious cycle was Donald Trump. A lot of people voted for Trump, not because they were racist, not because they were sexist, not because they were bigots. Although I would say there was probably a good percentage of them that did. But there was a vast majority of people who voted for Trump who voted because, one, the thought of voting for Hillary Clinton was morally repugnant to them. And, that's like a devil's bargain. It's like a Rosemary's Baby of politics. There's no winning there. I understand where they're coming from, sadly. For as much as I fucking loathe Trump and everything he stands for, I wasn't the biggest fan of Hillary Clinton either. I think she came with similar, not worse, but similar baggage. I think he was far worse than she was. But, people who voted for him because they wanted to shake the system up, because median household income in this country has only gone up 5% since 1999. And, we've lived through 9/11. We've lived through 2 wars in the Middle East. We've lived through terrorism. We've lived through the financial crisis of 2008. And I've said this before to other people. We're living through the political crisis that was bound to happen had the economic crisis not happened. What we're living through right now is a consequence of the economic crisis of 2008. What happened back then was that there was a neoliberal elite on both sides of the political spectrum in the world that got their shit together and created a unified political movement to stabilize the world economy and to stabilize the political institutions, and to pass meaningful reforms. You saw this in Europe, you saw this in the United States. That happened, right? And yes, there was fierce opposition. Here in America, there was the rising of the Tea Party movement on the right, and then Occupy Wall Street on the left, and this sort of trashing of elites and this trashing of this and that and the other. And so we saw the economic crisis. Well, now that we're sort of out of the economic crisis, we've hit the political crisis. And the political crisis is happening precisely because a lot of the central core problems that came out of the crisis of 2008 have not been solved. There's still a vast majority of the world and a vast majority of Americans who are not employed, a vast majority of them who are underemployed. You have a lot of people who have 78% of Americans, I just saw this recent poll, 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So we're living in this situation where people are working harder and harder. They're getting less and less and less. If you adjust for inflation, the minimum wage today is actually less than it was in 1960. You have less, and so all of this is happening. And people feel like the system has completely fucked them over. In some ways, it has. But instead of fixing the system, which is my instinct, is to get in and be a reformer. Go in and fix stuff. Use the institutional knowledge of people who've been there forever, and use the new and fresh ideas of new blood who are coming in, and come to a coalition of ideas and bipartisan reforms to make things better. And that's what I believe in. And maybe that's a fucking pipe dream, and it kind of at this rate's looking like one. But I think it's very important to make that distinction, because what we're seeing now is not that. What we've seen is a constant, fuck 'em, we're going to destroy this shit. And Donald Trump ran on that, and it was extremely palatable to people who were angry. And he tapped into people's populism. He tapped into people's, quite frankly, their nihilism about the political process. That they were just like, fuck it, let's burn this motherfucker down, and we're going to go forward with this. And so it's no surprise to me that this is exactly what happened. But it's heartbreaking. I mean, I was up all night the night of the election. I was completely dismayed. And I talked to a friend, who was moving to Germany. He studies World War II, and he studies the Nazis. And do I think that Donald Trump is as bad as the Nazis? No. I do think that there's a certain level of authoritarianism in him that is very dangerous. And the thing that I'm more worried about with Trump is, yeah, Trump is awful, and this presidency has been a fucking shit show. But what I worry about is that he's paved the way for a more articulate and intelligent and motivated political populist authoritarian to come after him. Because he's sort of broken the floodgates, if you will. That, the whole adage of, it can't happen here. Sinclair Lewis, well, it kind of did in some respects. So I was very angry. I went to protests after the election. I was pissed off. I was angry at people. I was angry at the system. I was angry at the fact that our country couldn't see how bad a candidate he was and do the right thing. And yeah, Hillary Clinton was shit, but we needed to do that for the betterment of the country, but people were like, fuck it, we're going to burn this fucker down. And that really has led to, in my opinion, an absolute disaster of a presidency. And that's not even to mention the Russia stuff, but it's a mess, and if we live through 4 or 8 years of this, it's a fucking mess. It's awful. And yet the Democrats don't really seem to have learned from their mistakes. They seem to double down on the identity politics. They seem to double down on this sort of, we're going to build an entire political movement on just being against Trump. And while that's good to be against Trump, trust me, I think it's good to be against Trump. I think it's equally problematic to just have a movement based on what you're against. You need to really have a movement based on what you're for. And I think that there's nothing wrong with being the party that believes in diversity and believes in inclusion and believes in tolerance. I think that's beautiful, because there's clearly one side of this political debate that doesn't believe in any of that. So I think it's really good, right? But there's a difference between embracing all of that and embracing sort of identity politics in its most extreme form and letting that override every other important thing, whether it's issues of economic justice or political campaign reform or things like that. The Democrats really need to hone in on that, and I hope that they do. I don't see it yet, and I've said to people for months now, you don't underestimate the ability of the Democratic Party to fuck this up, because they'll find a way to fuck it up. I've watched them fuck it up for years, So hopefully they get a little better. And I'm still a registered Democrat. I will largely vote Democrat. I think the Republican Party is so devoid of reality. In this recent healthcare debate now with Graham Cassidy, they're so devoid of reality that it's just insane to me. But that's not to say that the left doesn't have its problems. I think they do. And so with all of that in mind, I've been reading a lot about the New Center. I've been reading Bill Kristol's stuff and David Brooks's stuff and things like that. And most importantly, I think the book that's really had a big impact on me, and I haven't finished it, but it's an incredibly powerful book, is The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker. And he talks about how there are 3 myths in culture that have emerged in the 20th century that have led to huge problems for us politically. One of them is the blank slate, the idea that human beings don't have an innate human nature. It's not built into them through evolution. We're literally just blank canvases from birth, and we can everything is nurture. Nothing is nature. The noble savage is the second one, which is the idea that somehow, which also feeds into what's called the naturalistic fallacy, which is if something's natural, it's inherently good. It's that if something is quote unquote primitive, that's not my words, that's others, that it's somehow more noble than something else. And this comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others. And the third one is the ghost in the machine. The idea that we have like a soul, or there has to be this sort of external ethereal thing that makes things run. That's not a part of nature. That's not a part of us. And Pinker argues that all three of those are wrong, that there is a built-in human nature to us when it comes to cognition, when it comes to preferences, when it comes to a certain extent IQ and cognitive ability. A lot of that's built into us by evolution. And as well as preferences for certain things, as I mentioned earlier, and so as well as language abilities, the language instinct, which he was very well known for. So one of the problems I see in our modern political discourse is the denial of human nature. So on the left, you see it particularly with the regressive left, or the more extreme left, where they deny biology. They literally deny our human nature, our inherent human nature, that we are a sexually dimorphic species with variations, that we are that we have built in sadly we have built-in intellectual and cognitive biases. Sadly, there will be people who are smarter than you, and there are going to be people you're going to be smarter than, and aggregates and averages are different. The problem is that view of it, which shows that human nature is very complex, but it's built into us. It's nature as well as nurture. It's not just all nurture, and it's not all nature, but a lot of it is nature, and we're denying that nature. That it's leading to huge problems politically, because we've now led into this sort of realm of postmodern moral relativism where we're not being clear-headed about human beings. One of the ways of that is the pay gap. And I know that Christina Hoff Sommers has made a really great video about this on her channel, The Factual Feminist, and others have made this point. I know Thomas Sowell made this point in his book, The Vision of the Anointed. The reason there's a pay gap is that men and women fundamentally do different jobs. They do different things. Now, that's not to say that's bad. And there's obviously overlap. It's not like, it's like a Venn diagram, or you think of it as a bell curve where most people are somewhere in the middle and there's outliers. But the reason is that, men tend to go into fields that tend to pay a little better, that are, based on sort of analytics and engineering and things like that. Which, again, not to say that women can do that very successfully. My sister-in-law is totally that. She's a software engineer. She's, I think she has bigger balls than most men, and she's amazing. She can hold her own with anybody. She's tough as nails. She's great. So again, she is somebody who is clearly an example of how this is not like set in stone tablet fact. These are broad consensus ideas that we can then extrapolate from. But that 77 cents to the dollar thing is complete nonsense. I mean, it's just nonsense. The pay gap is nonsense on that level. Now, if there is a pay gap within a specific industry for no reason other than gender, that's not that broad statistic, that is a problem, and that should be addressed. Clearly, should be addressed, because that is discrimination on the basis of gender in terms of wage compensation. That I will totally grant people. But on the whole, the reason there's a gap is because women and men just do different jobs. Men tend to do jobs that are more based on analytics and engineering and things like that. Women tend to do jobs that are more based on human services, things like that. And again, that's based on human nature. The fact that men tend to be a little bit more analytical, they tend to be a more less empathetic. Women tend to be more people-oriented, and they tend to be more empathetic. So, it's no surprise that there's these things. And again, these are broad concepts here, right? This is an average. Not everybody fits within average. And there's going to be great diversity within the workplace in terms of the positions and the policies that people have, or the jobs that people hold. So again, this is not something that can't change. And we're seeing this shift already. There are more and more women in STEM, men are going into nursing. This is starting to change, and I think that's great, But to deny that there are these differences, which again, aren't bad. There's nothing wrong with them, right? People can be whoever they want to be and do whatever they want to do, and I applaud that wholeheartedly. But these are realities here. And again, it goes back to human nature. And if we continue to deny human nature, if we continue to deny biology, if we continue to deny, that there are real things to know about each other and real differences sometimes, that we're going to be in peril because we're not going to be able to think clearly about public policy. So that's just one way of thinking about it. And so, Pinker's book is, I think, excellent about this. And and I know that Thomas Sowell has written about this too, and he's a huge influence on me, which is funny because he can't stand Barack Obama, and I voted for Obama twice. But Thomas Sowell is one of the most important and influential and in my opinion, insightful political writers on the right. I really do. I mean, his book, The Vision of the Anointed, completely changed my life in terms of how I look at public policy. And the reason it did was for one key thing, is he talks about the difference between the tragic vision, which is the vision he holds, and the vision of the anointed. So he talks about the vision of the anointed are sort of like, public policy utopians who tend to be on the left. What the vision of the anointed tend to do is they tend to go, here is a problem. We have a problem. And it's horrible, it's awful, we got to do something. Doesn't really matter what it is, but we got to do something about it. We got to do it now. Can't wait, we got to do it now. Without regard for the consequences of what you do. We got to do it now. And so they pass a policy. And oftentimes we judge the policy based on its intentions rather than its results. And so sometimes if a policy didn't work, if it works, yay, great, we got something done. We can do it again. But if it doesn't work, we don't, the vision of the anointed tends to not go, okay, well, this didn't work, we'll stop this. No, they tend to go, oh, if only we gave it more funding. Oh, if only the opposition, weren't so steadfast against us. Oh, if we had had more support. Oh, if we only had done more of this. And they tend to double down if the idea works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't. Whereas the tragic view doesn't see the world in terms of quote-unquote problems and then quote-unquote solutions. It tends to see life as a series of trade-offs. And that's what it is, that anytime you solve a problem, you can also cause one. And that public policy, is extremely complex and messy. And there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers, there's going to be free riders, there's going to be rent seekers. You're always going to have that problem. It's just inherent in the nature of public policy because humans aren't perfect. And we are fundamentally self-interested and we're, and sometimes we're fundamentally selfish. That's the tragic vision. And it's the vision that's right. That public policy is complicated, that it relies on a very diverse plethora of ideas and perspectives and cultures and identities to give us better understandings of public policy. That's what it requires in terms of making effective change, right? And so with all of that in mind, I'm joining the New Center. And, if people ask me if I'm still a Democrat, I'll probably say yes. I'm not leaving the Democratic Party. I'm a registered Democrat. I don't really care about that because the Republicans are awful. So on the whole, they tend to suck. Not conservatives. There are a lot of conservative intellectuals who I quite like. I love Thomas Sowell. I think that while I don't always agree with him, I do think Ben Shapiro is somebody to listen to. I feel the same way about Jordan Peterson, and others. But I think what I'm arguing for is a return to sort of politics of civility and a politics of ideas, where we're openly discussing ideas and we're not getting bogged down in identity, and rather we're talking about ideas and making complex public policy decisions based on a diverse and open marketplace of ideas. And if we can do that, then we can really do a lot of good in this world, and we can be a country that is more free, that is more diverse, that is more inclusive, that is more tolerant, that is more progressive. If we do all of those things, but shouting people down and making professors retract stories and firing people for having differences of opinion and this and that and the other, that's a huge problem, and that leads to a cultural rot that is going to harm our country, because it's just negating who we are. And so I'm joining the News Center, and I'm very excited about the prospect of more and more people joining the News Center. And I urge you to check out the News Center website that Bill Kristol has put together with a Democratic colleague of his. Let me pull up the website here real quick. It's called, let's see here, newscenter.org. I'm going to be delving into that a little bit myself, newscenter.org. Also, check out Sam Harris's comments on the News Center. I think they're quite insightful. And then I believe that David Brooks wrote a recent piece called, What Moderates Believe. And I think it's a very good piece, and I think it's very good to read. So that's sort of my politics rant, if you will. This was an unscheduled podcast, so I'm not using my regular mic. I'm not using my regular thing. So I apologize if the audio quality isn't great and some of the sound mess ups and things like that. This is a special episode that'll be probably going up soon. That's just my ideas. And I look forward to hearing what you think. Do you think that it's good that we're having this sort of broad new movement of people in the center, people who are center left, people who are center right, people who are in the center who are arguing for more politics of civility and open inclusion of diversity, not just of identities, but of ideas, and calling for more civil dialogue? Or do you think I'm completely full of shit? Do you think I'm just, a alt-right shill, or, a liberal cuck, if you will? Leave it in the comments below. Send us an email at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. I love to hear your feedback, good, bad, or sideways. Please follow us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us feedback. Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/reasonrevolution. We're growing by the day, and I have a very dedicated following, and I'm really looking forward to other future conversations. Look forward to a new podcast going up soon. My interview with Bangladeshi ex-atheist Zarin Feroz. I hope I'm saying her name right. Really looking forward to talking to her, and I'm going to be having a couple other guests over the next few weeks. Really great, diverse subjects we're going to be talking about here on the show. And I just want to do a shout out to some of the people who really helped me evolve on this issue. Steven Pinker, Dave Rubin, Peter Boghossian, Michael Shermer, James Lindsay, Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, Faisal Saeed Al-Muhtar, Ali Rizvi, who wrote the great piece about the News Center in terms of dealing with Islamism around the world, which is a HuffPost article. I strongly encourage you to read it. Sarah Hayter, David Smalley, and others. These people are champions of free expression and free ideas. Richard Dawkins, for Christ's sake, Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, all these guys, Steve Simpson and Onkar Ghati of the Ayn Rand Institute. Great folks over there doing, I think, really great discussions about free speech and college campuses. So all these people have really influenced me. And again, I'm really excited about the future of American politics if we can build a broad coalition that I want to call, and that we are all trying to collectively call, the New Center. So until next episode, this is Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.